Committee. And we're going to try something a little bit different as part of our programming to begin the year 2015. In that we're putting together a series of policy forums that are nonpartisan and open to the public to help educate ourselves and the community on issues that are important to all of us. I want to say a couple of thank yous before we get started with tonight's panel, which should be great, on the subject of education in charter schools. First, I want to thank the committee, the subcommittee, that worked really hard over the last 5 weeks to assemble the fantastic panel in front of us today. Amelia Encalado, who's sitting over here with her laptop, as well as Fran Burke, who unfortunately is ill and could not make it tonight, and Shirley Kressel, who, believe it or not, is on the West Coast, but was extremely passionate and involved in the process related to this effort. And a kudos also and a welcome to State Representative Jay Livingstone, who helped out with the planning of this program as well. And I should also recognize, sitting to Jay's right, is State Senator Will Brownsberger. So thank you both for attending. This big open space is because when we get done at 8:30, we're going to bring down the disco ball. No, I'm just kidding. I do want to say that to those Ward 5 committee members that are here, there will be a brief meeting at 8:30 when we finish. We have a couple things to take care of. It'll take no longer than 20 minutes because we're all going to get out of here in time to watch the President's State of the Union speech at 9 o'clock. If for those of you who are here, where attendance matters, we ask you to check in with Chris Donnelly, who's the secretary of the committee, seated over here on the left. If you're new, we'd love for you to come back, love for you to get on our email list. Please see Chris after the forum and he can sign you up so that we can spam you profusely over the next several months. Just kidding. But we will be planning other forums, so we'd love to get you on our list so that way we can continue to tell you the great stuff that the committee is doing. With that, I'd love to kick off our panel on education in charter schools, and I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for tonight's panel, a distinguished and very well-known scholar in education who just finished a whirlwind trip around the world, but specifically flew back just for this forum, right? Just kidding. No, just kidding. But we're thrilled to have him with us and to lead our discussion tonight. His name is Dr. Pozzi Salberg. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Let me stand for a moment. What a pleasure to be here. And I'll introduce myself a little bit more, but I would like to start by asking the panel to introduce themselves. You know, this evening I met most of these people, actually all of you first time, so I don't know you before. So I'll give you a first word just to say briefly who you are and where you come from before saying anything else about the topic of the evening. Jonathan.
My name is Jonathan Horton. I'm a professor of economics here at Suffolk. I'm originally from Ireland and did my undergraduate work there and then came to study in the US where I met my wife and have never looked back.
My name is Jennifer Berkshire. I formerly worked for AFT Massachusetts, which is one of the statewide teachers' unions. I edited a newspaper and became very interested in urban education. A few years ago, I started an irreverent blog about education reform called EduShyster, and I often write about charter schools.
I'm David Turk. I'm Executive Director of the Beacon Hill Institute and Professor of Economics at Suffolk and therefore a colleague of Jonathan. And I also have a very hard time keeping my balance while I'm walking down cement sidewalks. I tried to explain to Fran Burke that I was utterly unpresentable, worse than usual, but Fran has a way of not taking no for an answer, so here I am.
My name is Kathy Skinner. I'm the Policy Director for the Mass Teachers Association. We're the state affiliate of the NEA, which is the largest labor union in the United States. I'm an urban teacher and administrator. I'm a nationally board certified English teacher, and I've worked in Boston, Somerville, Cambridge, Lawrence, and Gloucester.
Thank you very much. My name is Pozzi Salberg, and I come from Finland, as you know. How many of you don't know where Finland is? Everybody knows. You know, there are two types of people in the world. There are Finns and wannabe Finns nowadays when it comes to education. But I've been here. This is my second year now. I teach at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Really enjoy being here and learning a lot. One of the reasons why I accepted the invitation to come here tonight is that I want to learn more. And I must say that the charter school issue as a whole is something that is fairly alien to not only for me, but most people in Finland, because we don't. We have charter schools, but it's not really a question that everybody is very interested in talking about. Just to give you an idea, we have 3,000 schools in a country of 6 million people, and 75 those schools are what we call independent or private schools, as they formally are called, but they are really charter schools when it comes to the governance, how they are governed within the system. 25 of them are Rudolf Steiner schools, and 25 of them are different language schools, and then we have university teacher training schools and similar things. So this issue is not really a big one. People often ask me when I go and see my colleagues and friends back home, they ask me about education here. Many people seem to be thinking that American public education, the school education, is not really in a terribly good shape. And they ask my opinion, and my opinion is that personally I do not think that public education is in crisis here in America, except a couple of things that would be very difficult to accept and understand in Finland. Just to give you some ideas that really raise interest or ears in my country when it comes to news related to education here in the United States. Last week you heard that 51% of your public school pupils come from the poor homes, which is very hard to understand in a country like Finland, where child poverty rate is really low. Then you have, do you know what is the most common reason for children being away from school here in this country? It's the teeth, dental issues. 51 million lessons are lost every year because of the toothache in the United States school system. And in Finland, I would guess that nobody is ever losing a class or school day because of the problems with the teeth, because the dental health is part of the public education system everywhere. Another one is that we, in this country, you know that you have a huge number of teachers who start career as a school teachers, but then they leave. Almost half of the teachers leave before the end of the 5th year in this country, and we have a teaching profession that is completely different. The teachers go for life, and there are many other things like this that when these are broadcasted in Finland or in the world, people think that things are really lousy here when it comes to education. But if you look at the international performance of the United States as a nation compared to other countries, things don't look that bad. And that's why I think, firstly, I think it's very interesting to think about this charter school question here in this, especially in this state that is often compared to Finland and some of the other high-performing systems in the world. When I had a chance to sit down with the commissioner here in the state, the first thing he told me is that this state is like Finland in terms of education. And I asked him to tell me a little bit more about that. How does it compare? But people often think about only the learning outcomes when we're measuring math and reading and science and some other academic things, how countries perform. But if you look at the equity issue, for example, in the state of Massachusetts, it's nothing like Finland. So there we are completely different in a different part of the scale. But my first question really, after this introduction, would be to ask the panel to help me to understand how do you see the public education situation or system right now in this country. Are we in crisis, or are you in crisis here when it comes to public education? You don't need to give a long lecture, just a kind of first idea. How would you help a foreigner or alien like me to further understand this question? How should I think about this question of where are you with your public education system?
Do you want to just start and go down the line?
Yeah, maybe if we start with Jonathan and...
Sure.
Yeah.
If we look at comparisons between Massachusetts and, say, Finland, Massachusetts actually does very well by world standards. So I find it hard to believe that Massachusetts public education, or education in general, is in a great crisis. But, of course, it could be improved, as could almost any system. I'm not so convinced that education in the US as a whole is in such good health. In fact, it's not in as good health as in, say, Massachusetts. But calling it a crisis, that becomes a matter of semantics. clearly there's a lot more that needs to be done in some parts of the country. And change can occur quite quickly. I'm interested that, for example, in Louisiana, after the rebuilding, they completely rethought their educational system, and 60% of the kids in New Orleans now go to what amount to charter schools. That's a radical change, and it seems to have had a major positive impact. So I think there is quite a lot that can be done, and that's one of the examples that I would bring to mind.
Thanks. Jenny?
We're, no one's called me Jenny since high school. Kind of nice. It's fitting that, we're here tonight as there's a big debate happening about the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind and the extent to which yearly testing with a lot of stakes attached to it is transforming our public schools. And one of the things, because I'm not an expert in this field, I've been on a kind of self-directed study course. I got really interested in urban education and its history. And you can go back and you can literally see the definition of what we expect a school to do getting narrower and narrower over the decades. So in the 20s, there's a really broad vision of schools as a place to nurture democratic citizens. And now our definition is much, much narrower. A school is a place that raises math and English test scores. And that's a big difference. And the only other thing I would add, I was so struck by your description of child poverty, because we're in this, sort of relentless back and forth within the warring camps on the different sides of the education issues. Can you fix is poverty the problem or are schools the problem? And you notice a big difference post-LBJ and the Great Society, that the contemporary education reform movement kind of starts from the position that there really isn't anything we can do about poverty per se. We just can do a better job of parachuting kids out of it. So that's, I would add, that as a little bit of context for our crisis discussion.
Thanks. David, how do you see the situation?
Today I started out my senior seminar in economics by playing some clips from Jonathan Gruber for my class to give them an object lesson on how not to be an economist. And my point was that economists have to be particularly careful about how they confuse their economic analysis with their policy views. Now, I'm going to violate that very dictum at this moment and tell you the tension that I suffer over this. And that tension comes from the fact that I agree with Jonathan that there is no crisis. What we have, however, is the corrosive influence of the teacher union government school monopoly on education in the United States, which is the core problem that we struggle against when we come to things like standardized testing and charter schools and the like. The teachers union is particularly pernicious in this process, as demonstrated by their track record in opposing charter schools, opposing standardized testing, and standing blatantly for the welfare of their members as opposed to the welfare of the students that their members are supposed to be teaching. But from my point of view, the ultimate goal here is to break up this monopoly. Charter schools are a step in that direction. A more significant step will come when we go to voucherizing education, and that will help a great deal. What we want to do is we want to replace the government school teacher union monopoly with a market-driven education system, and we will then discover that schools can really educate their kids, and not necessarily with these standardized tests that most of us have a lot of misgivings about.
Thank you. Kathy?
So as the union shill at the table, let me just say that I kind of don't agree with pretty much everything that David said. But first of all, I think is there a crisis? David Berliner wrote a book entitled The Manufactured Crisis, where it's kind of ginned up to make the public kind of lose faith in a public system that at the end of the day, really, all of us have benefited from. I'm the product of public schools to some extent. My mother was a public school teacher. I'm the 5th generation of teacher in my family, so I'm really, kind of committed to the enterprise. But there is a crisis in terms of the multiple mandates that are being kind of driven down on school people by either the state or the federal government, so that if you walk into a schoolhouse today, people who have the interest of children at heart, as do teacher unions, have the interest of children at the heart. No one ever went into this profession to become a union activist. They went in because they really were committed to the enterprise. And people are exhausted from the mandates around testing. In Massachusetts, retail, everyone's having to learn how to teach English language learners because the state essentially failed to do that when the UNS petition passed. So there are lots of things coming down on school people that, quite frankly, are exhausting them out in some cases. And they feel as though the curriculum is being narrowed because what is tested is what matters and what isn't tested isn't what matters. So I think there is a crisis in terms of perception. I don't think there's a crisis so much in Massachusetts statewide, but are there crises in little pockets? Are we doing well for all of our kids? We're not. We have gaps. We have big gaps in the state because we're a rich state. So we have gaps, and we have to acknowledge that, and we have to figure out how do we do better for the students that we're not helping right now.
Thank you. You know, one thing I really appreciate here in the United States, and I've been here before, I must say that I worked and lived 5 years earlier in Washington, D.C., but I'm fine now. and the same thing I learned there, that it's wonderful to see how people can debate and have very different views about things. That it's not so common in my country. You know, when people disagree, they start to have a fight, or then they don't say anything at all. It's too early here. so I'm really looking forward to this. I would like to move to take this conversation now closer to the school choice and this charter school thing, and hear from all of you what your own view is more specifically regarding the charter schools. That is a topic here, and there will be a lot of time for you people also to take part in the conversation if you wish. If there's anybody who would like to step in while we are talking here, that's fine. That's fine too. But again, this is something that I probably don't. I must admit that I don't have enough both understanding and knowledge about this case, because the charter school question particularly is something that has not been in the agenda in many other countries that I've been working and living, and that's why I came here also to learn and understand more from you guys. How do you see this thing? So I would like to give you a turn, one after another, to explain a little bit what is your own position. How do you see the charter school question, particularly here where we are right now, and obviously, depending on what your view is, to explain, help us a little bit understand why you think like this. And then I have couple of more specific questions probably to clarify those things, and then I'll invite all of you to join us for the conversation. Who would like to go first?
I'll start this time.
Okay.
I'd like to go first this time. So I did bring a one-page handout, but I did a study of Boston charter schools that came out about 5 years ago after a Boston Foundation study around high-performing charter schools. Personally, I'm agnostic about charter schools, and contrary to what David said, the Mass Teachers Association has no position on charter schools. We're neither for them nor are we against them. But I was intrigued by the Boston Foundation study only because there was a lot of data that's buried in footnotes, and I'm always somewhat suspicious of footnotes that, really kind of tell a story. And so I started looking at these schools, and what I learned was that if you compare these, quote, high-performing charters, and I keep saying high-performing because that's how the Boston Foundation kind of characterized them, and embedded in the report was this phrase, the selective out-migration of low achievers, which I just thought sounded like 1984-ish to me. But what I found was that the charter schools are not, in fact, enrolling the same students that the Boston public schools are enrolling. And what I looked at was not race, because Boston is a minority-majority school system, as are the charter schools. But I looked at poverty and the levels of poverty. So what percentage of students are getting free lunch versus what percentage of students are getting reduced lunch? And then the percentage of students who are English language learners as opposed to former English language learners. And then the percentage of students who are SPED, but not only students with disabilities, but what kinds of disabilities do they have, because that matters. And what I found was that we are essentially creating a dual school system and a two-tiered school system that is essentially discriminatory in that the charter schools are pretty much enrolling fewer poor kids and then fewer really poor kids. They don't enroll English language learners. And they enroll students with disabilities, but what in the trade we would call point 1 kids, students who are essentially able to be taught in a regular education classroom with a few supports. So that, and as a result actually of this study, legislation in 2010 was passed that tried to close some of these gaps. On this two-pager I've handed out, I picked one school, quite frankly, at random, the City on a Hill Charter School, because it's been around for 20 years. And I would argue, I don't know that we've actually done anything as a result of the law. And there are other issues I could talk about, but I think I've started you.
Sure, thank you very much. David, would you like to go next?
I'm going to let Jonathan speak to the study that the Beacon Hill Institute performed, which employed a methodology somewhat similar to the methodology that we just heard about by the Boston Foundation study. But I will, since I have this chance, I'll refer you to a recent opinion editorial in the Wall Street Journal where the author compared what she called charter school rich districts with charter school with districts that didn't have very many charter schools at all, and was able and showed that the charter schools not only outperformed the district schools, but that in the districts, in the areas where there were more charter schools, the district schools tended to improve their performance as well because of the competition from the charter schools. In districts without very many charter schools, they were falling in their performance. The district schools were declining in their performance. In the districts with a high abundance of charter schools, the district schools were improving in their performance. This is exactly what you would expect when you unleash competition on the school system, which is in fact the enemy of the teachers' unions. The teachers' unions are in business to keep competition out of the system, and their officials will invoke any evidence that they can find that suggests that somebody somewhere suffers as a consequence of the charter school, ignoring and bypassing the fact that the charter schools consistently outperform the district schools when we compare their performance for similarly situated students. And I'll let my colleagues pick it up from there.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, before you elaborate on your study, I'll jump in with a more recent one that just you might have seen today in the Globe or heard about on NPR, that it turns out that graduates of Boston charter schools complete college at a lesser rate than graduates of Boston public schools. This was another Boston Foundation related study. Numbers that are very surprising. If you dig down, I love the footnotes too, but they followed the graduates of 5 charter high schools in 2007. There were 80 graduates, which you may notice that's kind of a small number, right? 5 high schools, 80 graduates, and 42% of those completed college. And so, you do the math, and we're in the 30s. If you know your charter data, you know that the classes get smaller and smaller as you get towards senior year. And by senior year, the boys have drifted away at a much higher rate. So the gender ratio tends to be about 2/3 girls, 1/3 boys. And so you do the math, and 5 charter high schools produced approximately 10. They sent 10 boys to college who finished. My complaint, since I started writing about charter schools in Boston, is the size of the promise being made relative to what these schools actually produce. It seems unfair for parents who go into these schools thinking that they've won life's lottery and then find out that the reality is much more complicated. It's unfair for our public discourse because we don't have full information. The state collects reams and reams of data, but we really only get the data that makes it into the newspaper. So I would just read those footnotes and ask a lot of questions about what the, if this is what's going to raise our city up by putting all kids on a path to college, ask how big the path is and how many kids are actually making it down.
Thank you.
I have a somewhat less negative view of this. If we take a nationwide view, there are around about 6,400 charter schools. That's twice as many schools as in all of Finland, which is not bad for a movement that began in 1991 with one school in Minnesota. So I do think that this, is the glass half full or half empty? For me, it's definitely half full. That's 2.5 million students. Charter schools are smaller than average schools, but it's still a lot of students. There are as many students in charter schools nationwide as there are in magnet schools. So in that sense, it's an important group in its own right. And in some ways, the policy issue before us is whether that group should be bigger, should be 5 million or 10 million rather than 2.5 million. That's an important debate. And I think that's what we're here about. Now, I think the second problem, indeed, today's Boston Globe had some numbers about college completion. The problem is that in order to figure out how many people have graduated within 6 years of starting college, you really have to wait till 6 years after they began college. And in 2007, relatively few people were coming out of the charter schools because the charter schools were so new. They began in Massachusetts at the elementary level. They expanded gradually, and the number of schools at the high school level that are charters was still very small even 6 years ago. So it's just too early to draw strong conclusions. But some conclusions, so the question then is, how are we going to evaluate charter schools? And this is where it's a serious technical problem. Because you can't just look at scores in charter schools compared to non-charter schools, because the populations, as pointed out, are really quite different. But I would, if we don't look just at Boston, but we look at Massachusetts as a whole, I would strongly dispute the early suggestion that charter schools are not necessarily getting to the poorer students. The study that we did just a few years ago, which looked at, say, 2007-2008 enrollment, found, for example, that charter schools, about 1 in 4 students were African American, whereas non-charter schools, it was about 1 in 14. So charter schools in Massachusetts serve minority populations much more heavily than non-charters. If we look at Hispanics, we see something
But that's
similar.
because most of them are in cities. I mean, you
That's
have to
fine.
be, I
That's
think you have
fine.
to be honest about this. The vast majority of charter school seats are in cities, and cities are way more diverse than suburbs. So, I mean, it's not surprising.
Oh,
I mean, that's kind of cherry-picking the data just a little bit.
In aggregate, you currently all the rich schools in Newton and Wellesley, et cetera, and then you said that, look, you have a lot of white people in that, and they go to public schools, but all the charter schools are in urban areas, so of course they're going to have more African American minorities.
Right. So what we need to do, but they're going to have more Hispanics, and they do. About a quarter of charter school students are Hispanics, and nearly 50% of charter school students get subsidized lunches of one type or another. So we cannot argue that charter schools are somehow or other cherry-picking rich areas. Quite the contrary. And now the question is, how do we judge those charter schools? Because if we simply look at the plain charter school scores, we really need to compare those scores with comparable public sector schools. Public sector schools that have similar levels of poverty or of ethnic composition. So the right way to make the comparison is then to try to compare charter schools with matched non-charter schools, and then look at what the results look like. And when we do that, what we found and what Angrist and others have found is that the charter school performance in tests looks to be a little bit better at 8th and 10th level, grade level, than non-charter schools that are comparable by the measures that we can measure.
But that's after they've pushed out kids so that you only have, as they said in their study, the selective outmigration of low achievers. So the low achievers are gone. So the claims to success are based on the kids who are left behind. I just wanted to clarify one thing, because charter schools didn't start as elementary schools across the board. If you look at the two-pager that I handed out, City on a Hill is a 20-year-old school. It started as a high school. It was in the first wave of charter schools. It was a high school. So to say that they started as elementary schools and worked their way up is inaccurate. We have elementary, middle, and high school charter schools that started all at the same time. So your argument is a little, I don't know.
I just had one very quick point about you're absolutely correct about how hard it is to measure college completion, because it can take many years. But the problem of so few kids, especially boys, graduating has remained a problem since 2007. And last year, 4 boys graduated from City on a Hill. 75% of them went to college, but that's 3.
That's one school, and we're not talking about one school.
But
I suggest
as of May 2009, 12.5% of charter schools nationwide had actually been closed.
I suggest
and one of the differences between charter schools and non-charter schools is that charter schools are, in a sense, being held accountable, and when they're not succeeding, they are being closed. And that's, indeed, it could well be argued that that's the most powerful tool that's being used here. And it's a tool that we could, I guess, in principle, apply to any school, but we are much slower to apply to other schools, where we try everything but simply closing them down. And that is one of the differences.
We hear concerns that the parents wouldn't really send their kids to these charter schools if they knew the facts about what happened after graduation. I propose an experiment that we open up a seat in a charter school for every single minority student in the Boston area and Worcester and other cities. Poor students, minority students, open up a seat, and also have a rule whereby the public schools, which will see themselves emptying out as the students flock to the charter schools, not be kept in operation once they become non-viable any longer because of the outflow of students. I suggest that experiment. Now, what that will do is it will give these parents who apparently don't know what they're doing, most of whom, I would say a very large fraction of whom, want to have their kids in charter schools. It would give them a chance to exercise consumer sovereignty. I suggest that we conduct that experiment and see what happens. Now, one more thing. Yes, I saw that report in the Globe. Jonathan mentioned the study by Joshua Angrist. He also looked at this question of whether the gains from charter schools were sustainable. This is a 2013 study in which he said the following things. Charter school attendance increases the pass rate on the exam required for high school graduation in Massachusetts, with especially large effects on the likelihood of qualifying for a state-sponsored college scholarship. Lottery estimates also show gains on the SAT and on advanced placement tests. Charter attendance boosts SAT scores sharply, especially in math, while doubling the likelihood that a student sits for an AP exam and increasing the fraction of students who pass AP calculus. Now, if these facts get to the attention of parents of minority students, and if they have a seat in a charter school, they will take their students out of the district school and put them in the charter school. And then we'll have an interesting experiment as to what happens when we unleash consumer sovereignty on this system.
Thanks, David. Do you want to...
that experiment, interesting. Would you have some kind of caveats, like you can't suspend 70% of your students, you cannot suspend students for not wearing belts? Would that be something that would be inside of that experiment, or would it still be the same kind of pushing out all these same minority students who think that would be helpful?
I think that you're getting at something that are you trying to, are you telling me that the district schools are encumbered by rules that the charter schools are not? I think that...
No, it's quite the opposite. I mean, what I found, I looked at the parent contracts that charter schools required in the 09 study. I looked at the parent contracts. I looked at the student handbook, and in point of fact, in a lot of these charter schools, if a student came to school without the school uniform on, the student could either sit in the office for the day or wait till mom or dad came to the school and brought whatever part of the uniform was missing. In another school, students, I taught high school. I've spent 30 years of my life in the presence of teenagers. So in one school, a high school, students got demerits for slouching. I don't know about you, but slouching is a part of being a teenager. So they get demerits for being who they are.
Well, if slouching and if failing to wear the uniform inhibits academic performance, then good for them. Let's think of some more rules like that.
So actually the legislature said you can't do that anymore because it's discriminatory.
Oh, well, sure.
All right? And rightfully they did that. So I think that no, they don't, because, you know, if public schools had suspension rates of 75%, that means 75% of the students in the school were suspended at least once. That's not the repeat offenders. I used to be an assistant principal. I know about repeat offenders. But if 75% of the students in a public school were suspended, it would be on the front page of the Boston Globe that school didn't know what it was doing. And yet when charter schools do the exact same thing, people say they're holding kids accountable. No, they're not. They're pushing them out. They're pushing them out. They're making it difficult for those kids to succeed.
0.4 kids in, those are children with autism
No.
that may not take the MCAS, that they have to submit a portfolio, and these same students, they count in the aggregate of public school data as failing automatically without taking the MCAS. So if you have a school that's 100%, we all went to college and we all passed the MCAS, they do not serve any of those students. And I find that a badge of dishonor that these schools are not serving any of the special needs children that the public schools of this state are.
Every special needs child needs to get an education, and it needs to be supported by the taxpayers. But I find it just as offensive to think that we're allowing that principle to interfere with the opportunity that parents should have to put their kids in schools that will do a better job educating them, schools that will not.
Actually, at least Massachusetts-wide, charter schools, special education students of one type or another.
Education, as the panel's already told, so you have in the people that actually work in schools like myself, we have 0.4, they're called. For my particular school, we have 21% 0.4 students. We have a very large ASD, that stands for Autism Spectrum Disorder, in case you didn't know. And if you look at our data, if 100% of our students pass the MCAS, were proficient, the data would say only 79. Why? Because those 21% automatically fail, and that's state law.
Right, but they in the studies, for example, that Ancrist has done, what they did was this. They said, the way that we get at the effect of charter schools is by comparing the students, take the universe of people who apply for charter schools, because they may be different from those who are otherwise in public schools. And they may be different in motivation, their parents may be different, and let's compare those who were admitted by the lottery with those who were not admitted to charter schools because randomly there weren't enough spaces. And then following those through is a reasonable comparison. And so we can at least ask what happens to that group.
It's a very controversial study. They pretty much make up students, and then you compare them to students that are made up. It's a very complicated algorithm that MIT made up. I'd be glad if you could explain it to me, because I haven't figured it out. I guarantee the people that did the study probably didn't spend one day inside of the classroom. Didn't talk to any teachers like myself. And that's the problem, that people aren't talking to teachers. People aren't talking to people on the ground. People want to sit up in ivory towers and kind of, let policy unfold, and everyone can be experiments, But you know what? Urban children are not experiments we deserve. I'm an urban student. I graduated Boston Public Schools. I grew up in Dorchester. We're not experiments for people to just kind of, move around every 10 years to kind of see what happens and study. Okay, people don't study the kids in Newton. They don't study the kids in Wellesley. But people are studying my kids every single day, and nothing's really happening. We need to be supported. We don't need to be fighting each other. We don't need to be in competition. We all need to be in this together. And that's the problem that's going on right now.
Okay, well, Jonathan, very brief comment on this and then continue.
One could make the argument that the real experiment is that thousands of kids in Boston would like to go to charter schools, and they're not getting that opportunity. And I'm not sure who that's fair for.
Kids in Boston that parents wanted to go because they believed in this promise, which was a lie, and they got pushed out. And that's the truth.